All right, brilliant. Pádraig and John, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you guys here today.
Thanks, Wahid.
Thanks for having us.
Brilliant, brilliant. So, Pádraig, so you wrote a book on the Scramble for Africa. So, just for our listeners who don't really understand what a scramble is and then what a scramble for Africa is, can you give a bit of context by what you mean by that?
Sure. So my book is called The New Scramble for Africa, and I guess it takes its title from another period of history, but that there are historical resonances of now, which was the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which was when the major European powers basically carved up the continent between themselves and established formal colonies, whereas many of them had had a kind of informal presence before. So the new Scramble, the man who wrote the Scramble for Africa is a guy called Thomas Pakenham. So in the early 2000s, people started to talk about the idea that there might be a new scramble for Africa, and that was associated with a couple of things. So firstly, China was beginning to emerge as a major global economic power, not a geopolitical power at that point, but it was really beginning to assert its economic influence in different parts of the world, and particularly in Africa. There was also other things happening, like the US and British invasion of Iraq, which drove up oil prices. The US was looking to diversify its oil supplies away from the Middle East, which was perceived to be unstable. Dick Cheney, who was vice president at the time, had a kind of commission to look into that, how to diversify American oil supplies to ensure they weren't overly dependent on one region. And so there were a variety of things coming together at that time. China moved from being a net oil exporter in 1993 to a net oil importer. And because its economy was growing so rapidly, it needed all sorts of natural resources, oil, copper, tin, iron, all sorts of things to fuel its construction boom and also to fuel its manufacturing economy. So this is the idea
And the answer
of the
was
new
Africa,
scramble
yeah?
for Africa.
Right.
The answer was partly Africa. So Africa in the early last decade, at certain points in time, accounted for about a third of Chinese oil imports. That's fallen back to about 10% now. Again, the Chinese were becoming wary of becoming overly dependent on one region for oil supplies. So Saudi Arabia is the biggest supplier now. At some points in time, it was Angola in West Africa. So, but also Latin America, Eastern Europe. I mean, the Chinese economy, the economists have something called the rule of 72. And that is, if you divide the rate of economic growth into 70 or 72, that will give you the doubling time of the economy. And if China was growing at 10%, as it was for decades, that meant it had a doubling time of 7 years. So, the Chinese economy was doubling in size every 7 years, and that exerted absolutely massive demand for these natural resources that were sourced from wherever they could be, essentially.
And we'll come back to China in a bit, basically, because there's a lot to unpack there. But I just want to double click a little bit on the first scramble. You mentioned there about how the European powers sort of went in there and carved the continent up, I guess, with the Berlin Conference, Otto von Bismarck and stuff like that. But can you kind of paint us a picture of what were the motivations and what did it actually look like? And what happened basically, just for our listeners who are unaware of the 19th century?
Sure. So you mentioned Otto von Bismarck there, who was known as the Iron Chancellor of Prussia. And he united the German states apart from Austria. And one of the ways he did that was through the Franco-Prussian War. He forged that sense of kind of unity or identity through the invasion of France and winning that war. And one of the things that people have said is the irony is that Bismarck united Germany, but he divided Africa. And basically, he didn't want the great European powers to fight additional wars over Africa. He didn't consider it to be important enough. The German king or Kaiser had said that he wanted Germany's place in the sun. So Britain and France had colonies in India and different places around the world. Germany didn't have so many, so Germany wanted its place in the sun. Okay, but why did the scramble kick off in the late 19th century? If you think about it, most of the rest of the world had either been colonized or subjugated to European powers. So from Australia to North America, South America, but a lot of Africa remained independent. And so there are a number of reasons for that. The first, some people have said, is that actually African states and societies were sometimes quite militarily strong. So the Ethiopians defeated the Italians famously at the Battle of Adwa in the late 19th century, for example. But far from the idea that Africa was a place of kind of relative underdevelopment, some people have argued that actually some of the societies were strong and were able to resist European intrusion. Okay, so that's one thing. Second reason was advances in technology. So quinine, which is an anti-malarial, was first extracted from tree bark in 1820. And European mortality rates in West Africa were very high because Europeans didn't have any natural resistance to malaria, and also yellow fever was prevalent there as well. So some of these technological innovations or advancements enabled the European colonization of Africa. So that's the kind of background. In terms of the factors that really pushed it, there were a number of things. First one was the American Civil War. And what that did was it restricted supplies of cotton to the global market. And obviously, Britain at that point was the world's kind of workshop of the world. The textile and clothing industries were huge. Manchester and the surrounding cities accounted for about a third of world supply of textiles at that point in time. But they're having difficulty getting access to cotton during the American Civil War. So you find these textile manufacturers actually writing to the British Prime Minister and saying, look, we need to open up new sources of cotton supply. India isn't enough. We have to find other territories where we can source cotton. So that's one thing. Secondly, the broader European economy entered what was known at the time as the Great Depression from the early 1870s. It's now known as the Long Depression, lasting until about the end of the 19th century. And so because economies were depressed, European powers were looking for new markets for their products. There wasn't the purchasing power in Europe to really propel further industrialization, and there was excess industrial capacity, so there was a big push to open up new markets, and the Scramble for Africa was part of that. A third reason was geopolitical, and Britain was the world's preeminent power at that point in time. But it was being challenged by the French and the Germans. And so there were also geopolitical motivations. So, for example, the British wanted to control, and the French and the Portuguese and others, strategic trade routes and territories. So if you look at the map of Africa, and we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about this, but if you look at the geography of the Gambia, which was Britain's peanut colony, essentially, it's at certain points only a couple of miles wide on either side of the Gambia River. And the British took that territory, essentially, because they didn't want the French to have it. This was considered to be a strategic trade route. It was also a major supplier, as I said, of peanuts for Britain. So it was a combination of those factors. The fact that the British Empire was coming to the height of its power and the height of its geographical extent was, before it went into decline, they were trying to capture territory and influence in order to forestall being overtaken by some of the other major European powers. Yeah.
Yeah. And that makes sense, really. In fact, it's interesting. Like right before this episode, I was working with like ChatGPT and the Gen AI, and it generated for me a beautiful kind of table around, okay, what European country colonized and where did it colonize and the main resources it extracted, basically. So I've got Britain here, colonized Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, and extracted like gold, diamonds, rubber, tea, cotton, like you mentioned. Then you had France here, who did like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, West Africa, Madagascar. Most of the stuff was iron ore, gold, peanuts. You've got Belgium, which colonized the Congo Free State, and then rubber, ivory, and copper, right? And the list goes on and on. So it was more like you've got tons of resources out there, and you just want to kind of build up the industrialization of your kind of countries, right? So it's up for grabs in a lot of ways.
So yeah, I mean the Cecil Rhodes, when he was the British Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in South Africa at certain points in his life, and he was a big industrialist, but he had a vision of British rule from Cairo to the Cape. And actually, if you look at those countries you were talking about there, Britain did colonize that line from Egypt through Sudan right the way down to South Africa. And that shows Britain was the dominant colonial power in Africa. The French tried an east-west axis across the Sahel, but they weren't able to quite manage it. And the Portuguese had something called the red map or pink map, the Mapa Rossa, where they again had their vision of the kind of strategic territory they wanted to capture in Africa.
Yeah, can I jump in there?
Yeah.
Many times when I worked at the National Assembly in Cape Town, I used to go into Company Gardens. I don't know if you've been there, where you've seen that statue.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Of Cecil Rhodes, and and it says behind it, "This is your hinterland." And as you just rightly said, he had a vision of building a railway line from Cape Town to Cairo. And one thinks of the gold rush, and you think of the foundation of the Cape Colony, and so forth. When you look at the Scramble of Africa, looking back, and having read your absolutely brilliant book,
thanks.
Do you think it was just about asset stripping, as Wahid just spoke about, to fuel the global economy in the global north, or what we call the global north today? Or do you think it was underpinned also by a transformative vision in any way to uplift parts of Africa?
Sure. Yeah, no. I think you're right. I mean, Rhodes felt that the great tragedy of international relations was what he called the division of the Anglo-Saxon race. So the loss of the United States, and he established Rhodes scholarships at Oxford to try and bring future American leaders to the UK to study, in the hopes that they would influence a kind of reunification with Britain. So his vision, so the Europeans, and the British in particular, talked about the 3 C's, which was Christianity, civilization, and commerce. And Cecil Rhodes, when he was asked what colonialism was, he said it was philanthropy plus a 5% return on investment. So any economic project like that, has to have an ideological basis to it. It can't just be, as you say, asset stripping, land and resource grabbing, because politically that won't be acceptable to people back in the colonizing countries, and certainly not to the people in the places that are being colonized. So there has to be an ideological dimension. And of course, people are complex. We're not just driven by money. We have all sorts of values and beliefs about what's right and wrong. And that vision that, this was in some way philanthropic, to take people's land, establish your rule over them, tax them, and so on, was the two worked kind of together. So Archbishop Desmond Tutu famously said, the Europeans came to Africa. They gave us the Bible. They told us to close our eyes. When they told us to close our eyes, we had the land and they had the Bible. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. So
that's a very good one.
So
very Desmond Tutu.
Yeah. So there was certainly a very strong kind of missionary aspect to this,
Yes.
and interestingly, Irish Catholic priests played a kind of strong role in this regard in terms of the expansion of the British Empire. So even though Ireland was a colony of Britain, and even though Catholicism was not the main religion in the mainland UK as it was then, nonetheless they were part of this, some people have argued, colonial project by bringing education, by bringing Christianity. So even though there were tensions and conflicts there, nonetheless, it functioned as a kind of ideological whole or structure.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, actually. And we just circling back to in terms of the Berlin Conference and Bismarck's sort of carving up of Africa. So, how much do you think those kind of carving up processes, that he did, actually affects Africa today, or Africa through the 20th century as we enter the 21st century, basically?
Yeah. So sometimes when people think of the Berlin Conference, they think of the European, big powers and some of the smaller powers like Belgium, who had a subsequent conference in Brussels in 1890 around the slave trade. And the suppression of the slave trade, again, was one of the justifications for the scramble for the continent. They think of them drawing lines on a map. And if you look at a map of Africa, a third of the borders are actually lines or follow lines of latitude and longitude. So if you look at Angola, or you look at the northern border of Angola, you'll see these straight lines, and that gives the impression that they sat around a big map and they kind of drew it. And that's true to some extent. They kind of agreed spheres of influence, but the objective of the Berlin Conference was actually to allow all European powers to access African resources. So rather than having, the idea was that you wouldn't have a scramble which could potentially result in military confrontation.
It's like a win-win, basically.
But the way it worked, well, for some people, so
okay.
it didn't work out like that. So they did establish something called the doctrine of effective occupation, which was basically you had to show you were capable of administering the territory. And this set off a kind of race which culminated in something called the Fashoda incident, Fashoda is in modern day Sudan, where the French and the British faced off against each other, and they had to call in the I think it was the Americans to mediate it, and they resolved it in favor of the British. So there's something called Fashoda syndrome, where the French feel that they have been disadvantaged by the Anglophone powers historically. And that's one of the reasons France has retained such an emphasis on Africa in its foreign policy, maintaining French military bases, linking many West African, linking the currency of its former colonies, or many of its former colonies in West Africa, to the franc and then to the euro. So the Berlin Conference did carve up, or laid the foundation or framework for the carving up of Africa. And that had a variety of impacts. So there were political impacts. So these arbitrary, or sometimes arbitrary, lines on the map obviously divided different ethnic groups. So you have Somalis in Kenya, you have some of them in Ethiopia and other places, so that was one thing. Some people said it put together ethnic groups that created these kind of territories that were multi-ethnic, and that created for potential for conflict in the future, particularly in the post-colonial period. But the other thing that the European powers did was they invented ethnicities, and they also engaged in what's called retribalization. So using the old strategy of Roman strategy of divide and rule, so if you can get people to identify with their ethnicity, and you pit ethnicities against each other, you can play one against the other, and you can remain in power in that context. So there's a huge debate about the impact of the conference. The other thing it did, of course, was it created these relatively small territories across a lot of the continent. So there are some countries with huge populations in Africa. Nigeria is about 200 million people, but many of them have quite small territories, populations, and resources. And what that did was it, in the post-colonial era, militated against economic development because you had a small economy. You couldn't develop economies of scale for your industries. The railway gauges were different between French and British colonies, so you couldn't develop integrated regional markets. The infrastructure was oriented to Europe, so if you wanted to place a call from Senegal to Cote d'Ivoire, or from Nigeria to Ghana, those calls would be routed through London and Paris, making them massively expensive. So there were all sorts of economic impacts. And what people have sometimes said is that African identity, and of course we have to be careful not to talk about Africa as a singular place. It's a huge continent of 54, 55 different countries. Yeah. Exactly. Economically, socially, politically, and so on. But some people have argued that what those kind of colonial processes did was to bolster ethnicity, ethnic identity, but also then, because of the division of Africa and its exploitation by the colonial powers, also to give a strong identity with the continent, and not such a strong identity at national level. So there's strong African identity, some people have argued, and then strong local or ethnic identity as well, but not so much attachment to the nation state, which, because of the way in which these countries were created, weren't really nation states. They were plurinational states, and also the colonial legacy of authoritarianism and the way in which the colonies were ruled gave people a kind of bad taste, if you like, about the state and its purpose. It was often seen to be extractive and oppressive, rather than being representative of the population and their aspirations and needs.
It all feels very familiar and in a very European fashion. Just like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically, and with the Middle East as well, quite similar, I guess. But what I was trying to get at and understand from you was, there's lots and lots of literature written on kind of the dire poverty in Africa, and which is like a bit entrenched poverty, and how to kind of get along that, and geography, and those landlocked countries specifically are some of those countries where this kind of poverty occurs. So do you think that the way that Africa was carved up has any sort of consequence on how poverty is entrenched today, and how economic development over time happened there?
Sure. Absolutely. So, being landlocked is oftentimes a disadvantage in terms of economic development, right? Coastal sea transport is cheaper per unit. It's much cheaper to transport huge 20 or 40 foot containers on a big ship than it is to have them on trains or on trucks, and much more efficient. It makes it easier. It may reduce distance to markets, to overseas markets, if you're on the coast as well. But some people have said that landlockedness is actually a political construction. So if we think about India we don't think of as landlocked, but central India is landlocked. So it's the way those borders were drawn that landlocked certain countries like Rwanda or Burundi or others. Okay, so that's one thing to say. Now, the other thing is I think we have to be careful not to kind of ascribe too much importance to physical geography. So if you look at Switzerland is landlocked, but one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and by some measures the most industrialized country in the world. Okay, so what's really important is the kind of institutions, the politics, the policy, the history. It's not, landlockedness does not preclude economic development. It's these social and political and economic factors which I think are more important. The other thing that's happened in the last couple of years is people have talked about the idea of land linked. That is, if you can improve your infrastructure, you can actually use your landlocked positionality as an advantage. And I'll give you an example of that. So I was in Zambia, as I was saying to you, this northern hemisphere summer, and I went and I looked at 2 Chinese factories. One of them is a cement plant, which produces 60,000 bags of cement a day. Another one was a tile factory, which produces 54 square kilometers of tiles a day. But Zambia is landlocked. It's 1,300 miles from the sea. So these are companies which have established in Zambia in order to serve the regional market. And, even though it was thought it was a major disadvantage for Zambia, in actuality now it's been able to attract some of these massive investments precisely because of where it's located, as well as its history of relations with China.
That's quite interesting.
Can I come in there?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I was going to ask you this a bit later, but because it's the conversation's unfolding this way, I just found that so fascinated. And because when I was reading your book, and you mentioned about the telephone exchange, how calls used to go through Paris or Brussels, and I remember, when I sometimes would travel with a cabinet minister, or to somewhere in Northern Africa, you know what it's like from Johannesburg or Cape Town. You would have to go via. Often, if I was going to Algiers, you'd go via Paris and other places also in West Africa. And, you've spoken about how Africa's national geography and its distance has made developing comparative advantage strategies difficult for African states. And I read that very clearly. But are you sort of saying like countries like the example you've just given is Zambia, can that circumvent the problem of comparative advantage? That maybe it's not determined by a broad range of factors, but as Ricardo Alsman says, by really just simply knowing what to do.
So I think the conventional economics approach to this is let the market decide what you're good at. It's based on supply and demand and relative prices. And if you let market forces kind of reign untrammeled, then the market will identify what you're good at, and people will be incentivized to specialize in that. And if you focus on what you're good at, that will build up your capital. You'll be able to invest that, and then you'll be able to diversify. The problem with that strategy for much of Africa is that they became or were locked in as primary commodity producers during colonialism. So producing peanuts or copper in the Zambian case, or other low value added commodities. And prices for those historically trend downwards, whereas prices for many services and for more advanced manufactured goods trend upwards. So that locks you into what some people have called a trade trap.
Yes.
And the trade trap if the value of your exports are going down and the price of your imports is going up, you're going to have to finance the gap somehow. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by borrowing. So the trade trap feeds into then potentially a debt trap in time.
Yes.
So every country is different. Every country has advantages and disadvantages in terms of its economic development. But if you look at, you know, somewhere like Singapore, Singapore, when it separated from Malaysia, was thought to be a complete economic backwater, and it was felt by some people this was economic suicide, essentially. You know, carving off a city-state with no natural resources to speak of from a much bigger country, which was very resource-rich. How was it ever going to survive?
GDP, 20% of the GDP was just a U.S. air base in Singapore. You know, which is crazy.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So, but look at Singapore now. Singapore is one of the most developed countries in the world. So that's where the politics really becomes important. And some people have argued that if you look at the most successful examples of late development in the world, so South Korea, Taiwan, China, Singapore,
the tiger countries,
you know, the tiger countries, and also in the African context, maybe Ethiopia and Rwanda are sometimes mentioned as countries that have made great strides in development. It's because of the security context that because of either internal or external security threats, that's really concentrated politicians and policy officials' minds, and they've had to develop economic development strategies in order to build up their economies so they could defend themselves militarily, either internally or externally. So there's something called systemic vulnerability theory. And so, you know, the politics and the institutions and the history is really, I think, more important than, you know, the physical geography when we're talking about these kinds of issues.
Yeah. And just for me, out of curiosity, and John, we'll move on to your questions after this, but, you know, you talked about the institutions, you know, and the politics that's there. So in terms of the quality of these institutions in Africa as we see today, do you think the first scramble of like a bit of asset stripping, a bit of, you know, building up social, you know, kind of rafts and kind of going there, maybe even building up temporary institutions. Do you think a lot of that hindered or helped in the making of the quality of institutions in Africa, would you say?
Yeah, great question. So I think the short answer is hindered. So if you look at one of the most successful countries in terms of its economy on the continent, Botswana had the fastest rate of economic growth in the world from the 1960s through the 1990s. So faster than China, faster than some of the other countries we've talked about. And some people have argued that partly that was because it wasn't really colonized by the British. It was British Bechuanaland. You know, it was a arid and semi-arid kind of territory. There weren't many, or they didn't think there were many resources to speak of there. So it kind of went under the radar, and there wasn't the same intense colonization processes maybe that there were in other places. If you think about colonialism, it was an extractive institution. It was about getting the natural resources out and bringing in manufactured goods dear, suppressing or repressing the population, or trying to get them ideologically through religion or through attachment to, what are called neo-traditional institutions. So the British did things like appointed chiefs in South Africa, warrant chiefs. So these were not traditional institutions. Sometimes they were actually created by the colonists, again, in this divide and rule kind of tactic. So that extractive imprint is long-lived. And one of the things that it did was it made African states, many of them, into what are called gatekeeper states. So because the economies were bad, and in some cases, deliberately deindustrialized by colonialism, it gave the state a kind of special place as a site where these economic transactions could be overseen, mediated, and value extracted from them. So through border taxes, but the control of trade was where a lot of the money was, and the state kind of served that function of the control of trade. And so because Paul Collier, who I know you've had on your podcast as well, talks about this. He says, and I'm not sure that I agree completely, but he says, the best and the brightest in the Western countries go into engineering and finance, where there's a lot of money potentially to be made. He says in Africa, that's not the case. The best and the brightest go into politics because that's where they see that the money can be made, or, the potential can be kind of leveraged for business deals and procurement and contracts and all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
That's quite interesting. John, should we move on to your questions, or
Yeah, I just thought that was a really great observation, and I saw that in South Africa, where 60% of the public sector budget was on civil service salaries.
Incredible.
And I could see, from when I was working in government myself, they far outstripped the private sector salary. So I think you're really spot on there, and that was so interesting. Thank you. I think if I can just loop back to Ricardo Haussmann, because I see that you cite him in your book, some of your research, and he taught me at the Kennedy School, and so I'm a big fan. As much as I'm now a fan of your book, and he uses, just looping back to what I was saying, that famous analogy of the monkeys leaping from tree to tree. And saying about how to overcome the comparative advantage problem. How can African states move preferentially towards nearby goods with the problem of distance that you've so eloquently explained? And how can they really become powerful drivers of innovation in success in business and industry and services with all those constraints that you've described in your book?
Great and big question, and if we knew the answer,
I
know. but I think I suppose my perspective on it would be conventional economics tells us to let the market decide, but I think the market can lock you into these poverty traps that we've been talking about. And so you need to use the market to shape the market. And the way you do that effectively is through industrial policy. Now, some people say, government failure can be worse than market failure. And so if you have governments that are corrupt and inefficient, maybe the economic outcomes would be worse with industrial policy than if you let the market, kind of determine resource allocation. And that's an argument, but I think what it neglects is that you can build state capability. It's, the state can change and does change in response to geopolitics, internal political dynamics, capacity building programs, and all sorts of things. Now, what that industrial policy looks like will vary from country to country, but one of the continent's big problems is the offshoring of wealth. So, there's some statistics which say about half of Africa's private sector wealth is held overseas, in bank accounts and real estate in Florida or whatever it is. That's money which could be used productively on the continent. So, when South Korea was industrializing, if you exported foreign exchange illegally, that could be subject you to the death penalty. It was such a scarce resource, and it was felt to be so vital for industrialization that they kept foreign currency in order to import the machine tools, the components, and the other things they needed to industrialize. So the African market, African wealth, and stopping those particularly illicit financial flows, but also licit, not stopping them, but regulating them, to make sure that they're serving national developmental purposes is really important. The relative role that different factors will play will vary between countries. So Zambia, for example, has several hundred Chinese companies there. They employ about 50,000 people, for example. So it's been, quite successful in attracting Chinese investment. So that's part of the Zambian development strategy. Ethiopia has been very successful in attracting a lot of Chinese investment as well. Other countries maybe that aren't able to do that so much, maybe they have to have different strategies. Maybe they have to add value to their agricultural products. Rwanda, has this idea that it's going to be the kind of Singapore of Africa, and it's going to be a high tech and service financial hub. So different places can have different strategies, but for me, some of the components will be similar. And that is, retaining and using your own domestic capital in combination with foreign capital to bring in technology and skills and other things. Looking at how resources are used. I mean, from living in South Africa, the number of luxury cars on the roads there, is that a good use of money to spend it on Ferraris and Mercedes McLarens and all of these other kind of supercars, when you could, that could be used to, do all sorts of other things that are more socially and economically productive. So regulating trade and finance, if it's done well, and if it doesn't create a situation where you're just fostering what economists call rent seeking, which is basically you're going to the government, you're not very efficient, but you're just going to the government and you're making a profit by virtue of your political connections, and imports are being stopped from coming in or being heavily taxed, and you don't have to be competitive, so you can still make money, but you don't have to export. The South Koreans had a very different strategy, which was they modulated competition. So they looked at those companies they wanted to develop as national champions. They gave them subsidies and incentives to export. They also protected them from foreign competition initially that they couldn't compete with, but they didn't create these kind of rent-seeking, inefficient companies. They really focused on making sure that they were companies that were going to be focused on driving productivity and innovation in the economy and exporting and connecting into the global market.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think it's correct. One of the frustrations I know that President Ramaphosa feels in South Africa, for instance, is you're absolutely right. A lot of the large monopoly companies, because there's a lot of natural, in South Africa is very much a monopoly economy still, as you know, and in many ways bears very much the contours of the apartheid and the colonial economy. His frustration, I'm just pushing back a little bit, but I agree with you, is that they're saying, well, the problem of a lot of these large companies, that, as you just rightly said, they're sitting on massive profits that could be invested into the social fabric of society and to stimulate the economy. But but companies like Ashanti Gold, Anglo American, and so forth, they're saying yes, we want to, but part of the problem is that we don't have policy certainty and predictability. So I think that's one of the problems, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. But a country that is not that does have policy certainty, you've already referenced, and that's Rwanda. Have you been?
I have, yeah. I've been to Rwanda 4 or 5 times, I'd say. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Wahid and I have just been there. Absolutely fascinating visit.
Yeah.
And as you know, President Kagame, he very famously wants to replicate the small city strategy of Singapore, which you've just cited, and also to a lesser degree the other emerging middle powers like the UAE and Qatar. And if you see his ministers and civil servants, they're all studying the writings of Lee Kuan Yew. You see them on the plane; they're very austere. And President Kagame only appoints people if they're fit for purpose, if they can do the job. And I see the vision. I understand it, and as you just outlined that. But the thing with Singapore and the UAE, Dubai, Qatar, they're all super connected. They're literally on the global superhighways, aren't they? With, peerless aviation and shipping routes. Mm-hmm. Do you actually think, and you've mentioned the problem of being landlocked or the phenomena of being landlocked. Do you think his strategy is achievable and appropriate given the problem of distance? And do you think it is too far from other, to use that metaphor, other trees to trade goods and services with?
Yeah. So I suppose to talk about your tree kind of analogy there, so this is the product space theory, right? That it's if you're making machine parts, it's easier to move into machine tools. Because you're already making some of the components, it's easier to get to a close by industry rather than to start. Yeah, exactly. Something completely different, because some of the skills and technology will be the same or transferable and so on. So the problem with the comparative advantage theory is it says specialize at what you're good at. So if you're good at exporting cocoa, stick to exporting cocoa, but that can lock you into a trade trap. If you look at the most successful countries in the world economically, they have diversified economies, as you're implying there. So, Britain in its heyday, China now, the United States when it was the world's manufacturing, superpower. Switzerland is still the world's most industrialized economy and produces all sorts of things. It's not just chocolate and clocks. They do chemicals and pharmaceuticals and all sorts of, precision tools and all sorts of other things. So I suppose my question is, you have a limited number of trees you can jump to if you produce tea or coffee as your main export. You can process your coffee, you can try and capture, you can do some of the roasting and grinding and maybe packaging and branding, try and capture some of that value. But really, your economy is so kind of narrow. There aren't really other trees to jump to, and that's where government policy really becomes important. But to speak to your question directly about Rwanda, I mean it's a really fascinating question, and I think the vision for Rwanda is that it will specialize in things that are don't require physical trade necessarily. So I remember the first time I visited Rwanda was maybe 2009 or 10. And they very kindly at the university let me have an office to work in. And the internet speed was faster than my office here in Dublin.
Indeed.
So they had just installed all of these fiber optic cables across the country, and I was absolutely amazed, So the vision is to I think recognize the limitations, but to specialize or try and specialize in those services, finance, and other things, that can be conducted
higher up the
online.
value chain. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then also to try and boost tourism, capitalize on the country's, beauty, the fact that they have gorillas there. There was that controversial agreement with Arsenal, I think it was, where it said, visit Rwanda, and people were saying, is this a good use of money, putting a country's name on football players' shirts, but they have a huge new conference center in Rwanda,
we went.
Yeah, we were there as well, yeah. Incredible.
So it's trying to kind of look for those niches and leverage them for economic development, while also trying to develop the agricultural sector and add value, and processing value to that for exports, I think. Yeah. So I think you're right. Yeah.
Because I want to drill a little bit deeper. If I may, and I think you're absolutely correct. And I know in South Africa, when I was working in the office of the leader of the Democratic Alliance in Cape Town, we always referenced Kigali. We always say in 24 hours you can get a new business registered in Kigali. In contrast to South Africa, that takes months and months. That's if somebody hasn't lost your paperwork, And also what you've just mentioned is, that stunning broadband connectivity. I think it's got the highest level of internet penetration in Africa. I stand to be corrected, but I think so.
Okay.
So just just to unravel your question a little bit, do you think that Rwanda and small African states, the smaller ones, you've also referenced Botswana, which is always upheld by people like Mo Abraham, Foundation is a great shining light. Mauritius is another one. Again, with those rapid rates of growth. Do you think, rather than, trying to put behind that, that perennial problem of the resource curse in Africa and that dependency upon natural resources, do you think they could have the potential to develop into world-class tech and innovation hubs that compete with the world's best?
Yeah. So, again, a really interesting question. I suppose Botswana has a lot of diamonds and again has been able to manage those very effectively and invest the revenues into social programs and into economic development. So I suppose the resource curse is, some people have said it's more to do with governance, although there's debates about that. I mean, when you're talking about kind of tech and innovation, obviously South Africa is, a very developed economy and there are tech companies there. Cape Town is a bit of a hub for technology, but the one that gets a lot of attention is so-called Silicon Savannah in Kenya. You've seen a lot of startup companies. Nigeria also has some so-called unicorn tech companies.
Yes.
So with valuations of over $1 billion. So Flutterwave, I know, is one of those. It's interesting. The big kind of Western companies, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and the others, they're interested in Africa now. I think Amazon has just set up in South Africa, in Cape Town. Google is investing in innovation centers, and so there is potential at the moment. I think in terms of the kind of tech sector, there's what I call thin integration into the global informational economy. And that means that, Africa is still importing a lot of its technology from China, from Western countries. Most African universities are very, resource constrained. And if you look at, the big kind of tech clusters and hubs, often they go with universities. So, Silicon Valley and Stanford, for example. Obviously, U.S. government procurement played a big role there as well, but a lot of the tech development is around applications for mobile phones, kind of low-end, relatively low complexity stuff, and it's very hard to really make money, or a good bit of money.
It is
out of those kinds of applications. So I think, the Kenyan government is investing in something called Konza, technological city outside of Nairobi, with this vision that it's going to be, a major tech hub along the lines of Silicon Valley or Cambridge in the US or the UK for that matter. So it's very, very difficult. And because you're up against these big established players in that space, it's very difficult to compete with them, except at those lower end kind of applications. If you have a laptop, you can write a mobile phone application, but to develop a new chip, or the United States, I was reading, doesn't even have the capacities apparently to develop some of these ultra high end chips. They're very dependent on one company in Taiwan for that. So
TSMC.
It's a tough space.
85%.
Yeah.
It really is, and you're speaking to someone that can barely switch the iPad on that I'm speaking to you from. So
Well, I still operate a paper diary.
Rwanda is having a go. I think it is actually developing its own mobile phone. So let's see how that goes. It's having a go, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So that most famous son of Africa, Elon Musk. He was in London 2 weeks ago.
I saw that.
Bizarrely, or perhaps eccentrically, being interviewed by the Prime Minister. the impact of artificial intelligence, and Musk made headline news around the world, saying about the job losses is going to be unprecedented with artificial intelligence. It's going to cut a swath through the jobs market globally, already Africa, as you know better than I do, has got massive rates of unemployment, nearly 50% in South Africa. Male unemployment is really high across the entire continent. What can Africa do to mitigate this disruption, this biggest disruption since the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, great question again. So, so you were talking about I think we lost a little bit of connectivity there, but this massive disruption that's coming with what Richard
cutting off a little
Baldwin.
bit, Padraig.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Richard Baldwin talks about the globotics upheaval, so that it's not just artificial intelligence.
Can you not hear him?
No, I think it's stuck.
Okay.
Will I
can
turn
hear
up?
You now.
You can hear me now?
I hear you now,
and the camera's working? Okay. So I lost a little bit of what you were saying, but I got the gist of the question. So some people say that because African
you're cutting off a little bit, Padraig.
Okay, what should I do? Should I turn off my camera?
Okay, you're back. You're back now. Let's continue.
You're back.
Okay. All right. So just tell me, what should I do if I cut out Wahid?
Just continue. We'll kind of edit this
just
out.
Continue.
No worries, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because a lot of African economies are underdeveloped, some people say that actually the continent will be less affected by artificial intelligence. So you won't have, Richard Baldwin has a really good book called The Globotics Upheaval, and he talks about the convergence of robotics and artificial intelligence and some of these other technologies of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and how they're going to kind of gut the middle and working classes in the Western countries in particular. So accountants, teachers, doctors, all of these kind of professions could potentially be subject to automation. He says, if you think the populism we've had so far has been bad, wait until these technologies really, kick in and make their impact felt, which is worrying. But some people have said, Africa will be less affected because it doesn't have many of those kinds of jobs already, and so they won't be subject to automation out. Now, robotics is an interesting one, because most countries, when they have industrialized, have done so on the back of the textile, clothing, and footwear industries. They're relatively stable technologies. They're not highly skilled. Low wages can be an advantage in terms of getting your foot on the ladder of industrialization in those industries. And some of the processes can be automated in those industries. I've seen them myself, automated stitching machines, but a lot of the work is too intricate, apparently, to be automated easily or not cost effectively. So, where it might make sense to have a robot build a car, for now. Yeah. I'm sure you're right. Yes, they will develop and improve in time. But at the moment, still, it's not cost effective because you need that kind of dexterous hand work to do a lot of the assembly. So some people say there's still a window of opportunity there for African countries to capture, a greater proportion of that manufacturing trade, as wages have risen in China and Vietnam and some of the other countries, are getting out of those industries.
Thank you. Yeah. It was so interesting.
Yeah, Thanks. Yeah, that really makes sense, really. I want to move on a little bit, the conversation to more reflect your book, basically. And I think you were mentioning about China, and you've got huge sections in the book on China. Can you tell us more about what is exactly China's play here in Africa? Like, what is the vision of China in Africa? I think there's a lot of guff in terms of the Western perspective. There's like an anti-China kind of hate. Although Xi Jinping was in San Francisco just like last week, and they cleaned up the streets for him, right? But there's also like a lot of doom and gloom when it comes to China. So can you kind of elaborate on, from the CCP's perspective, what is the vision of China in Africa, and how are they sort of executing upon it, basically?
Sure. So another really fascinating question. I could probably talk a long time about,
Yeah.
but so I think the thing about Chinese foreign policy is it's flexible and adaptive. So they have produced now, I think, two Africa policies where they state, what their kind of relationship is, and what they hope the relationship will be. And it's pretty bland. It's about, well, we're win-win globalization. We were both, exploited by the Western powers with that common history of colonialism. So we're not like that. We're here to we're here to help, and that kind of rhetoric gets repeated again and again and again in policy documents, and obviously it serves a kind of ideological function. So I'm not sure there is a grand plan or strategy for Africa in the same way as there might be for Asia, because Asia is much more economically important to China, and China wants to displace the United States as the dominant power in the Asia Pacific that it sees as its backyard, and that some people have said maybe is the first step towards a much more prominent global role. Although you were talking about Xi Jinping in San Francisco there at the APEC summit, and some people journalists were commenting that he was basically making the case that now China and the US were on par with each other, that they were equal in terms of their influence in the international system. But I think Africa, some people have said, was more important for China in the early stages of its going out policy, because it was a test bed, because the Western powers had neglected Africa after the Cold War. Aid was cut dramatically. The British and the Americans disengaged substantially from the continent. Some people, and that left a kind of open playing field, some people have argued, for China to come in. Markets were small. They weren't really of interest to big Western companies, but Chinese companies hadn't globalized to the same extent. And because there was less competition, Africa was a conducive kind of test bed or market for them to globalize. So if you look at Zambia, Zambia had the first overseas Chinese bank in Africa, and first overseas owned Chinese mine as well in the late 1990s. So in that time period. And as I mentioned to you, Africa was a critical supplier of natural resources for China in the last couple of decades, but that importance and dependence is reducing. If you look at the total level of Chinese investment on the continent, it's around the same as it is in Germany. So Germany is Europe's biggest economy. It's the third biggest economy in the world, so it's a big economy, but that still gives you a sense, one country versus 54 or 55 countries. And China has something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is its kind of signature or signal foreign policy, which has been in place for 10 years now. And this was basically, there were different components to it, but for much of that time, it was giving loans from Chinese banks to Chinese companies to build roads, railways, ports, power stations, big infrastructure projects in Africa, but in other places as well. A lot of those projects have come unstuck or have underperformed economically. And so there's been a dramatic rowback in the last couple of years from 2016 in the amount of money that has been going to fund those. So new loans have fallen. During COVID, Chinese trade with Africa fell, private investment fell. We've seen the drop in exports of oil and some other commodities to China. But there's also a focus on some key strategic or critical commodities, things like cobalt, which are essential for lithium ion batteries, which go into electric vehicles. And there's real competition between the US and China around some of those minerals. So 40% of new car sales in China now are of electric vehicles. It's, I think, about a quarter in France by way of comparison. So some people said there's been a kind of a deprioritization of Africa economically. But that doesn't mean that the continent isn't important to China. It's important, or it's becoming increasingly important geopolitically. So in the context of what some people have talked about as this new Cold War between the West, or the US, and China, votes at the UN are important. All of the alliances that the US is trying to mobilize on global public opinion around the war in Ukraine, or even the Israel-Hamas war. There's a battle for global public opinion. So there's kind of a geopolitical scramble for Africa. Some people have talked about a third scramble for Africa, which is largely geopolitical. And then, of course, you have Russia into the equation as well. And, there's something called the Russosphere active in Africa, which is basically Russian disinformation on the internet, trying to sway public opinion in countries in the Sahel and elsewhere against the Western powers, and France in particular as the former colonial power in that region. So there's a very live kind of geopolitical contest and context now. And I was reading yesterday, apparently we're back to almost exactly the same number of democracies and autocracies in the world that we were at in 1990. So we see this Cold War analogy kind of coming through now.
Again.
Yeah. So so it's again a big question, but a very interesting one, and obviously has all sorts of political impacts. But democratization, I think, is one of the casualties potentially in the new context.
Yeah, I wonder if the reversal of the number of democracies, not only in Africa but also sort of around the world, is sort of because the 80s and the 90s, people equated prosperity with democracy, and I think that link has been decoupled in a lot of ways in the last 20 years, with a lot of populism, and the hollowing out of the Midwest in the US, as well as a lot of the economies, which, like Singapore, it's not a kind of democracy with a big D, but it's actually making great strides in economic prosperity, right? So I think people care more about the quality of life and a bit of freedom versus the operating principle of the government. Basically, that's what it kind of boils down to these days.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you're analyzing that absolutely correctly. And I suppose the other thing people have said is, if you looked at the response of Western governments to the global financial crisis, but what the Chinese called the North Atlantic financial crisis, because they didn't really experience it.
Interesting.
Monetary easing and quantitative easing, who did that benefit? Well, it benefited the bankers and the investor class, and ordinary working people saw inequality increase, dramatically. And of course, then that's going to feed into populism, electorally.
Yeah, that makes sense, really, and that's why I feel like we mentioned before, circling back full circle to more of Frederick Leistian industrial policy in Africa needed versus the more Milton Friedman laissez-faire, which, as you mentioned in your book, that Jeffrey Sachs mentioned as well, that it doesn't work, right? And just to kind of going back to your point, John, about Qatar and UAE, these countries becoming like hubs through the airplane travel, it's quite interesting. But it wasn't like that, like before the 90s and the 80s, and I was actually reading the biography of the current emir or the ruler of Dubai, and how in, I think it was the 70s basically, where his dad was ruling, and the Emirates Airlines was the epitome of the industrial
Sure.
policy because it didn't exist, So what he thought was basically create like a national airline and fund it. And yeah, you saw that geographically it's quite in the middle, right? So if we can get, people and trade flowing and subsidized for a long time, those big infrastructures you see in Dubai, the big airport, the airline subsidized for a long time. Now it's ROI positive, right? But it was all industrial policy that made them into that hub and did that specialization, diversification of the economy, like you mentioned, right? So some good industrial policy tooling actually can take you much, much far. So hopefully African can achieve that as well. That's brilliant. We'll start wrapping up. John, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, just one last one, if I may. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I about China, and there's an African leader. I can't remember who said it about the United States, but the Americans, they bring a lecture, and the Chinese build an airport, and I think that very much captures the raison d'etre of this discussion. But there's something that I find tantalizing and that intrigues me, and I think what you've just said about the financial crisis in 2008, which was never dealt with, and we're still feeling its impact today. And that is, as the neoliberal order seems to be in decline now, and certainly being questioned, and for all kinds of reasons: ecological, its sustainability, how indebted the global north is, particularly the United States, to China, and so on. And one looks at Africa. One looks at its communal approach, its humanitarianism. What you spoke of so compellingly at the beginning, almost an hour ago, about this Pan-African spirit. Africa, what Paul Kagame said: African solutions to African problems. So as we see a move away from the efficacy of the structural adjustment programs that were very much in vogue in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 20th century, as they're losing more and more credibility, and we're seeing the decline of the neoliberal order, do you think Africa has got anything to offer to reimagine the global economy?
Yeah. Again, great question. So I suppose I have a few responses to that. So Colin Crouch talked after the global financial crisis about the strange non-death of neoliberalism. Even though it was intellectually discredited, it was still being implemented. So, in Ireland and Greece, the pigs countries, as they were called in Europe, we had IMF austerity programs. So neoliberalism was still being implemented, even though it was neoliberalism which created the crisis. So it seemed a strange solution. But what we're seeing in a lot of Africa now is because of the debt distress and debt crisis across a lot of the continent, again, the IMF is being looked to by countries like Zambia and Ghana, and the prescriptions are still the same, cutting public expenditure, balancing the books, comparative advantage strategies, all of those kind of structural adjustment policies you were referencing there. So it's an interesting question as to whether neoliberalism is dead. And one of the things which is commentators have talked about is that it's now China which is the champion of open markets globally. It used to be the United States, but the US has actually gotten much more protectionist under Trump and also under Biden. And so you've had this kind of strange reversal that's kind of happened. And also that gives China a kind of potentially leadership edge in this context with the US. To come to your question about what Africa can offer, and I think that's again, a great observation about that collective spirit and will. And from South Africa, people talk about Ubuntu as a philosophy, the idea that we're not all individuals, as there is such a thing as society, to kind of counter what Margaret Thatcher said, that you exist because I exist. No person is an island. We can't survive without each other, and we need that social interaction, and we need the economic interactions with other people to survive. It's just kind of common sense. But what Africa can offer in terms of a vision, again, is really interesting. So you talked about the global ecological crisis. And, in Ireland or the UK or the US, we're big greenhouse gas emitters. I think Ireland, it's about 17 or 18 tons of carbon dioxide per person a year, similar to the US, largely because of our agricultural sector. If you look at Africa, most African countries are a ton, less than that. And apparently the Earth atmosphere system could sustainably absorb about 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. There would be no climate change. The oceans and the other sinks can absorb that. But it's just the scale and the pace of pollution has been so fast and so massive. So a lot of African economies are already green economies on that measure. As we in the global north talk about transitioning to green economy, African economies on that measure are already green. Now, obviously, many of them perform poorly in terms of welfare measures, but like some of the social indicators have been improving. Life expectancy has gone up pretty quickly in Africa in the last 2 decades. So again, the image of the kind of disaster, basket case, hopeless continent, as The Economist called it in its 2000 edition, is gone, hopefully. So it was never there really anyway. But
absolutely.
So in terms, I think the more ecological approach, the greater emphasis on kind of social solidarity. Again, we've lost sight of that in kind of many Western economies, where your status is determined by your wealth and your consumption power. So those are values and assets that can work with economic development in terms of levels of trust and those kinds of things as well. There are other potential benefits there as well. There's a really good book just out this year called Successes in Africa, Things Don't Always Fall Apart, by Julie Hearn. She talks again in that book about the economic successes in kind of unexpected places in Africa. So a lot of people talk about Ethiopia and Rwanda and Botswana, but she talks about places like Gabon. Now, Gabon has just had a military coup, so politically that may not be the most conducive to economic development into the future. But again, it comes back to this idea of systemic vulnerability theory that we were talking about earlier, where governments or regimes feel that they need to develop the economy to stay in power and to protect their citizenry, that can really, spur economic development. And so, there's huge diversity across the continent now in terms of economic performance. It's much different than the 80s and 90s when, the vast majority of countries really struggled economically. I think there's a variety of things, but I mean, for me, the lesson of the ecological crisis is that we are all in the same boat, and we're going to have to find ways of cooperating more to resolve some of these global challenges which threaten our existence everywhere. So the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, artificial intelligence is another. I know, I think it was Elon Musk said this could potentially be an existential threat to humanity. So we need to regulate these things, and we need to cooperate more. The Pax Americana is in difficulty or gone, some people say. So we need a new
Yeah.
global institutional architecture. And some people talk about a pax
Mm,
pluralis. We need new
mm,
global institutions which are inclusive, which don't just reflect the
Yeah.
Western powers, economic and political and military weight and history. But we need much more inclusive global institutions to cooperate on these kind of grand challenges. And that to me, Africa has been doing some interesting and innovative things around the African Continental Free Trade Area, for example, and cooperating more
mm,
deeply. But again, we need to scale cooperation or rescale cooperation to that global level and dial down the hyper competition of neoliberalism, because it will lead to climate catastrophe and biodiversity catastrophe amongst other ills in the long run.
yeah. That makes sense.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. And I hope that the
Thank
technologies
you.
like the internet can be an equalizing force, because it doesn't matter if you're in Africa, doesn't matter if you're in the US, everyone equally has a say and you can build stuff on top of it. You just need a laptop and an internet connection and a microphone, just like we have right now. So, on that positive note, we'll wrap up for today. Dr. Padraig, thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, all the best. Maybe looking forward to your next book whenever that comes out, hopefully.
Great. Thanks very much, Wahid and John. Great to talk to you both. Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you
Brilliant.
for your time. It was a
Okay.
wonderful
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you.